In 1978, China was one of the poorest countries on earth. The average Chinese person earned less than $200 a year. Famines had killed tens of millions of people. Cities were crumbling, factories sat empty, and the country was completely cut off from global trade. Fast forward to today, and China is the world's second largest economy, a manufacturing powerhouse, and America's greatest rival. China builds more skyscrapers in a year than America does in a decade. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It's the result of the most dramatic economic strategy in human history. A strategy so bold and calculated that it rewrote the rules of how nations build wealth. And here's what most people in the West still don't understand: how China actually pulled it off. The story begins with complete disaster. By 1976, Mao Zedong's communist revolution had devastated China. The Great Leap Forward of the late 1950s triggered a famine that killed between 15 and 45 million people. Think about that number. That's more than the entire population of Canada wiped out by government policy. The Cultural Revolution had torn apart the educated class, destroyed institutions, and left the economy in ruins. While Japan and South Korea were industrializing rapidly, China remained trapped in poverty, isolation, and ideological madness. The average life expectancy was just 65 years. Most people lived as subsistence farmers, using tools and techniques that hadn't changed for centuries. China's share of global GDP had fallen to less than 3%. That's roughly the same as it was in the 1820s, before the Industrial Revolution even reached Asia. Imagine being stuck in time for 150 years while the rest of the world moved forward. Then came Deng Xiaoping. When he consolidated power in 1978, Deng faced a choice that would define the next century. He could double down on communist orthodoxy, maintaining ideological purity while his people remained poor. Or he could abandon everything the revolution stood for and embrace the very capitalist systems Mao had spent decades fighting. Deng chose pragmatism over ideology. His famous phrase captured it perfectly: "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." The mice China needed to catch were prosperity, technology, and global influence. But here's what most people miss about China's rise. It wasn't just capitalism. China created something completely new. They built a hybrid system that combined market forces with state control in ways no country had ever attempted. While Western economists debated free markets versus government intervention, China ignored the debate entirely. They created a system where private enterprise could flourish, but only under the watchful eye of the Communist Party, where foreign investment was welcomed, but always on China's terms, where competition was encouraged, but strategic industries remained under state control. The first breakthrough was agricultural reform. In 1978, nearly 80% of Chinese people worked on collective farms. These were massive, inefficient operations where individual effort meant nothing and productivity was disastrous. Deng quietly began allowing farmers to lease land and keep their profits. This sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. For the first time since the communist takeover, Chinese people could work for themselves. The results were immediate and stunning. Agricultural output surged. Farmers who had barely survived suddenly had surplus to sell. And crucially, this surplus freed up labor for industry. Millions of people left the countryside for the cities, providing the workforce that would power China's manufacturing boom. The second breakthrough was the special economic zones. Instead of opening the entire country to foreign investment, which would have been politically impossible, Deng created isolated bubbles where capitalist experiments could take place. Shenzhen, a fishing village across the border from Hong Kong, became the first special economic zone in 1980. Foreign companies were invited to build factories, but with strict conditions. They had to partner with Chinese firms. They had to transfer technology. They had to train Chinese workers, and they had to export most of what they produced, bringing hard currency into China. Western companies got access to cheap labor. China got technology, capital, and most importantly, knowledge. Every foreign factory became a training ground where Chinese workers learned advanced manufacturing techniques. Every joint venture became an opportunity to reverse engineer foreign technology. Every export contract became a way to accumulate foreign currency reserves. Within a decade, Shenzhen had grown from 30,000 people to over 1 million. The fishing village had become a modern city, a laboratory for China's capitalist experiment. But the most important strategy was currency control. While other developing countries let their currencies float freely, often leading to inflation and instability, China kept the yuan artificially weak through strict capital controls and massive dollar accumulation. This made Chinese exports incredibly cheap on global markets. A Chinese factory could produce goods for a fraction of what it cost in Europe or America, not just because of lower wages, but because the exchange rate made Chinese labor artificially inexpensive. Western economists complained this was unfair, but China's leaders understood something deeper. In the early stages of development, fairness is a luxury poor countries cannot afford. Every developed nation in history had protected its infant industries through tariffs, subsidies, or currency policies. Britain did it in the 18th century. America did it in the 19th century. Japan and Germany did it in the 20th century. China was simply following the same playbook, but on a massive scale and with perfect timing. The timing was everything. China's reforms began just as globalization was accelerating. Western companies were desperately searching for cheaper production sites to compete in increasingly brutal global markets. Shipping costs were plummeting thanks to containerization. Communication technology was making it possible to coordinate complex supply chains across continents. China positioned itself at the center of this revolution, becoming the world's factory just as the world needed a factory. And here's where China's strategy became truly brilliant. They didn't just manufacture products, they built entire ecosystems. When Apple wanted to produce iPhones, China didn't just offer cheap assembly. They created clusters of suppliers, from rare earth miners to precision component manufacturers, all located within hours of each other. When a Western company needed a new product designed and built, China could deliver prototypes in weeks, not months. This wasn't just competitive pricing, it was competitive capability that no other country could match. The results speak for themselves. Between 1978 and 2010, China's economy grew at an average rate of nearly 10% per year. No country in history had ever sustained such growth for so long. Over 800 million people were lifted out of poverty. That's the largest reduction in human misery ever achieved. Life expectancy rose from 65 to 76 years. Literacy rates soared from 66% to over 95%. Cities that barely existed in 1980 became megapolises with populations larger than most countries. But China's leaders understood that manufacturing was just the first stage. As wages rose and the population aged, the old model of cheap labor would eventually hit its limits. So they began the next phase, moving up the value chain. Instead of just assembling foreign designs, Chinese companies began developing their own products. Instead of just copying foreign technology, they began innovating. Instead of just competing on price, they began competing on quality and features. This transition required massive investments in education, research, and infrastructure. China built more universities in 2 decades than most countries build in a century. They sent millions of students abroad to learn from the best institutions in America and Europe, then incentivized them to return home with advanced knowledge. They invested trillions in high-speed rail, fiber optic networks, and smart city technology. Every infrastructure project positioned China for the next phase of global competition, and they began playing a longer game than their competitors. While Western companies focused on quarterly earnings and Western politicians worried about election cycles, Chinese leaders thought in terms of decades. Their 5-year plans set clear, measurable goals for technological advancement. Their Belt and Road Initiative created trade relationships across 3 continents. Their investments in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and renewable energy weren't just business decisions. They were strategic moves to dominate the industries of the future. Today, China is no longer just the world's factory. They're the world's largest market for automobiles, smartphones, and luxury goods. Chinese companies like Huawei and TikTok compete directly with American tech giants. Chinese infrastructure projects span from Africa to Latin America. Chinese universities are producing more PhD graduates in science and engineering than the United States. The country that couldn't feed itself 40 years ago is now shaping the global economy. Here's what makes this transformation truly remarkable. China achieved it without following the Western model of development. They didn't adopt Western style democracy. They didn't privatize state owned enterprises completely. They didn't open their capital markets to foreign speculation. They created their own path, combining elements of capitalism and socialism in ways that Western textbooks said was impossible. This challenges everything we thought we knew about economic development. For decades, Western economists insisted that political freedom was a prerequisite for economic growth, that free markets required free societies. That government intervention inevitably led to corruption and inefficiency. China's success proves that these assumptions were incomplete. So, what can we learn from China's transformation? First, economic strategy matters more than economic ideology. China succeeded because they used whatever tools worked for their specific situation. Second, timing is everything. China's reforms succeeded partly because they coincided with global trends that created new opportunities. Third, patience pays off. China's leaders thought in terms of generations, not election cycles, allowing them to make investments that wouldn't pay off for decades. Most importantly, China's rise shows that economic destiny isn't predetermined. 40 years ago, experts predicted that China would remain poor and backward indefinitely. They were completely wrong. If you want to understand how the world really works, study China's transformation. It's the most important economic story of our time, and it's still being written. Hit subscribe to dive deeper into the strategies that reshape nations and the lessons that history teaches about power, prosperity, and the future of global competition. The next chapter of China's story will determine whether this rise continues or whether success breeds the seeds of its own collapse. And that's a story you don't want to miss.